Hi, and welcome everyone to Articulated English Standard and ELD. We're very excited to have you join us tonight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of Australia and recognize the continuing connection to land, water, and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you're on and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and future. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning, and research practices within the university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. This is a very quick outline of what we will cover in the webinar tonight. I will quickly run through some of the housekeeping, and then we will hear from a wonderful academic presenter on all things poetry and identity. So there will be a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you use the Q&A function on Zoom at any stage throughout the presentation to submit any questions you may have. We will try to get through as many as we can. However, you can always email our team if there is anything that we did not cover tonight, and we will get back to you. The webinar will be recorded and we will share with everyone who has registered, and it would also be added on a learning resources webpage. Will be free for everyone to access. We have enabled closed captions for tonight. Please make sure that you click on the show captions icon to view. And as I said before, if you have any questions after today's webinar, please feel free to email us at fast.partnerships@sydneyedu.au. Tonight's webinar is delivered in partnership with our Discipline of English and Writing, and it could have been possible without Dr. Matthew Sussman and his willingness to share his research and teaching insights on poetry with us. We're very excited to cover this topic as part of our Articulate Talk series, particularly as it was requested through our high school contacts, and we very much appreciate your contribution and ideas in designing the talk. We hope everyone here tonight find it helpful with your upcoming assessment. And Matthew, over to you. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, can everyone see my screen and hear me? Okay, wonderful. Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation today. My name is Matthew Sussman, and as Joyce said, I lecture in English and Writing Studies at the University of Sydney. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today about these three poems. I should say from the get-go that I'm not actually a specialist in contemporary Australian or Asian Australian poetry. My main area of interest is actually 19th century British literature, but that's not necessarily a disadvantage for us, because none of the poets that we'll be looking at expects us to come to their work with a deep knowledge of their cultural background or traditions. As immigrants or children of immigrants, these poets know what it's like to grow up with missing links or incomplete knowledge about their histories or even themselves. And that's, as we'll see, often a significant part of the poems that they write. So in my talk today, I'm going to start by examining how these three poems operate as what we might think of as unfolding dramas of self-discovery, not only for their authors, but also for we readers who may know little or nothing about the cultural histories being described. I'll talk about the nature of poetry in general and why it's helpful to understand these poems as poems of identity. I'll then consider one by one how each poem uses language to construct an image of the poet's self that is both highly particular, but also widely accessible and artistically compelling. And I'll end with some reflections about the nature of poetic expression in a multicultural society like Australia that I hope can help you when you encounter not only these poems, but other poems of this kind. So to start with definitions, I think one of the simplest and most direct ways of thinking about poetry comes from W.H. Auden, a major poet of the 20th century. In a lecture of 1956, Auden said, "The questions that interest me most when reading a poem are two. The first is technical. Here is a verbal contraption. How does it work? The second is, in the broadest sense, moral. What kind of a guy inhabits this poem? What is his notion of the good life or the good place? What is his notion of the evil one? What does he conceal from the reader? What does he conceal even from himself? I think this approach is helpful because it splits into two the main things that draw us to a poem. First, Auden acknowledges that a poem is above all a work of art, a highly designed contraption or machine that creates a verbal whole out of many internal parts. Poems have many different effects on us as readers, so to take an interest in the technical side of poetry means you're trying to discover how those effects are created. And poetic technique is linked to Auden's second point, which is that all poems represent the subjectivity of a poet or a speaker. That is a real or imagined person whose unique history and attitude toward experience gets embodied by the poem. To use his language, every poem constructs the image of an individual guy or personality or outlook or worldview, and we cannot understand who that guy is or how he or she or they feels about the world outside of the language that he uses to create himself. Sometimes, depending on the poem, he's also using language to recreate himself if the poem describes an experience that has already taken place or is being recollected in memory. So that's why, right, poems are invitations to get to know someone via their construction or reconstruction of experience in a complex verbal form. And Auden's approach to poetry calls to mind another famous description of poetry by the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill. He says, poetry and eloquence are both alike the expression or utterance of feeling. But if we may be excused the antithesis, we should say that eloquence is heard, poetry is overheard. Now, that definition is worth noting both for what it gets right and what I think it gets a bit wrong. When Mill uses the word eloquence, he has in mind something like public speaking, the art of public speaking. So he's distinguishing between the public use of language to persuade and teach people, like you might find in the speech of a politician or a newscaster, and the private use of language to reflect upon something or make it beautiful, which Mill thinks is the province of poetry. And that captures something true about poems, which is that they do seem to provide a very private window into an unobserved self, offering us deep glimpses of a poet's psyche or subconscious and the personal memories that dwell there. That's why we often get the sense that we are overhearing the poet in a moment of intimate exploration and self-discovery. But it's important to keep in mind that poems, though they often appear spontaneous and private, are carefully prepared public documents, just as they are intricately designed. They are published in magazines and books and often intended to be read by as wide an audience as possible. So it's not really the case that poems are private events that only concern the poet, that we just happen to be lucky enough to overhear. They can be just as didactic and educative as a speech or a newspaper article, only their means for achieving that end is different. And I think the American critic Helen Vendler gets a bit closer to what's happening when she says, we are not to listen to the speaker of a poem, but to make ourselves into the speaker. In other words, poems are highly subjective works that ask us to inhabit the mind of the guy or speaker and see things as they do. And yet we do this without forgetting that there remains a difference between what the poem asks us to experience and the pattern of attitudes and desires that define us in our normal, everyday lives. The three poems we're looking at today, I think, are quite interesting because they draw attention to that difference between the privacy of the poet and the public nature of the poem. On the one hand, we know that these poems are by Asian Australian authors. We know this because they're brought together in an anthology of writing by authors of Asian descent, which you see a picture of here, and thus we expect that they will contain a repertoire of memories and images that may be unique to members of those groups. That's the private side of poetry. But at the same time, the purpose of any anthology is to introduce the reader to the type of work collected under its name. And by asking us to inhabit or speak these poems in our own voices, we're meant to learn what it's like to experience life from their point of view. So I call these three poems poems of identity because they self-consciously foreground questions of who the poet is and how they came to be that way. And yet they do that private work publicly through language that's available to everyone, even as they identify and describe the influences and idioms that make them unique. And that shuttling back and forth between the private self and the public audience, between the individual poet and the universal experience, is actually something that we're quite used to in a modern multicultural society like Australia, where sometimes the only thing that unites everyone is the recognition that we are all different from each other. For example, in Sydney alone, 39% of the population are first-generation migrants. That is people not born in Australia. That's we're getting near half the population. That's statistics from 2021. And in Australia as a whole, around half the population, that is of the entire country, was either not born in Australia or has a parent who was not born in Australia. So even though we all come from very different places and contexts, each of us is also likely touched in some way by the experience of being from somewhere else. And that idea that we are all unified in a similar way by that experience of being different is a common subject in the modern poem of identity, of which these three texts are excellent examples. Noting that there is no one way of being Asian or Australian, or indeed Asian Australian, the editors of the anthology in which these poems first appeared, well, not first appeared, but were collected, the editors printed the poems alphabetically based on the surname of the author. And that's how I'm going to start too. I'm going to start with Merlinda Boas's poem, This Is Where It Begins. The first thing I want to draw your attention of the poem. This is where it begins. It's assertive, factual, and deictic. That's a fancy way of describing that the word this seems to point directly to something determinate and precise. It's pointing something out to you. That title presumes a confident speaker. But that sense of self-confidence is kind of a fake out, and it's immediately ironized or rendered suspect by the epigraph that follows. Once upon a time in Bicol, Filipino English, we tell it over and over again. The epigraph here acts like a little footnote or explanation for readers who can't read the languages below. So it automatically assumes this distance between the speaker and the reader. But there's also a distance between the speaker and herself. For what we're told by the epigraph is that the poem is going to begin the same way, but 3 different times and in 3 different languages. First, in the Bicol dialect, which comes from a small set of islands in the Philippines. Second, in the Filipino language, here called Filipino, which is how it was spelled before a new alphabet was adopted in 1987. And then in English, which is the language of the poem and its primary medium of transition. So suddenly we're confronted not with one beginning, not one this is where it begins, but 3. 3 different verbal starting points that conjure up 3 different times and places. And that very lack of determinacy, or what we might call over-determinacy, because there's a plurality of starting points rather than just one, that's further emphasized by the epigraph seeming to equate this is where it begins with the phrase once upon a time, something we tell over and over again. So unlike the title of the poem, which suggests a specific time and place, the phrase once upon a time evokes the prehistorical or even transhistorical realm of the fairy tale, where either nothing has ever happened because it's fictional, or everything is always happening because fairy tales occupy this timeless space outside of normal history. So this is a beginning that is both highly certain and also uncertain. Uncertain for both the poet and the reader, and that uneasy combination continues in the next couple of stanzas, which I'll just read. This is where it begins. I am 6 years old, perhaps 5. Grandmother is storytelling about the crab stealer hiding under the bed. Each story word crackles under the ghost's teeth, infernal under my skin. I shiver. But perhaps this is where it begins. Grandfather teasing me with that lady in the hills walking into his dream. Each time a different color of dress, a different attitude under my skin. I am bereft of constancy, literal at 6 years old, perhaps 5. So on the indeterminate side, the speaker can't remember whether the formative events of her life took place when she was 5 or 6. And she's unsure whether it was her grandmother or her grandfather's stories that mattered most. And her responses to those two storytellers also vary. In listening to her grandmother, she's excited and also terrified, itself a kind of paradoxical mix. And every time she hears her grandfather's story, she's struck by the changeability of the lady's dress, which makes her feel bereft of constancy. So as far as memory goes, this is a vertiginous and haunted landscape where the ground seems to be constantly shifting and nothing is exactly what it seems. And for readers who don't know the folklore that she's talking about, that might also be your impression. Who is this lady and what is the crab stealer? But there's certainty in these two stanzas as well. As the speaker knows that whatever the it of the title refers to, and she hasn't told us yet, its roots are somehow in the stories of her grandparents and the physical responses that she had to those stories, which bury themselves in her skin and become part of her physical, psychological, and if you take that word skin literally, ethnic identity. The phrase under my skin is a particularly resonant one because it can refer to something that becomes part of you in a positive way, as when the person you love gets under your skin and you can't stop thinking about them and obsessing about them. But it can also be negative, as when someone's annoying habits get under your skin and you simply want to get rid of them. So part of what drives our interest in this poem, as it's been set up, is a desire to find out whether under my skin will be positive or negative, something that the poet can make peace with, or something she'd rather, if we stretch the metaphor, laser off. As we move through the poem, the influences on the poet multiply, moving from grandparents now to parents and getting us closer to the present moment. Or this is where it begins. Mother reviewing for her college Spanish exam. Ojos, labios, manos. Suddenly also under my skin, long before I understood. Eyes, how they conjure ghosts under the bed. Lips, how they make ghosts speak. Hands, how they cannot be silent. Now, this stanza is very interesting because it presents the first confrontation of the speaker's indigenous or native Filipino culture with colonial power. The Spanish colonized the Philippines in 1565. So the Spanish lesson represents the imposition of yet another language to add to the earlier ones we saw on the poet's developing sense of self. Again, multiplicity and confusion. But notice how the poet's encounter here with the most public or hegemonic, forceful form of official language actually stimulates a desire to transform those words into a kind of personal idiom. She reclaims them. Lips, eyes, and hands, which she has translated from Spanish, are not just body parts or things to be translated, but they are for her the very tools of the storytelling that she's analyzing. Eyes that allow us to see the past, lips that give our ancestors voices in the present, and hands that can gesture when speech is not available. We now get the sense that the author is reviewing stories so that she can make better sense of her own vocation as a storyteller, as a poet. And this all comes together in the next stanza, where her father completes this family tree to unite the poem's ideas too. I remember too, father gesturing, invoking once upon a time. This is where it begins. Story, word, gesture, all under my skin. At 6 years old, perhaps 5. So here we have a concatenation of everything that's been presented to us, all the little idioms, the uncertainties, and the translations. It's a climactic moment because the poem finally defines what the it of its title refers to and where it begins. What's the answer? In the collective practice of storytelling that starts not with the one story of an individual person, but with storytelling in general, with that magical conjuring once upon a time that buries itself into the child's ear and instills a bevy of memories, some fuzzy, others more concrete, that all contribute to who she is. Many poems start from a point of doubt or disequilibrium that give them an occasion to be written. It's always worth thinking about, why is this poem being written? And we can see in retrospect that the title of this poem, which seems so certain and declarative, was really more of a question in disguise. How does my identity begin? Where do I come from? And why am I a writer? It was unclear in the first few stanzas whether the poet would welcome the complexity entrained by the answer to that question. That there is no one this, there is no one it. There's only a series of overlapping thises and its. But she now appears comfortable with that complexity, because discovering a single point of origin turns out to be less important than the accumulated effects of many cultural influences over time. In the last line of this stanza, all under my skin, we can also see how the poet continues to take control of language to develop her own idioms and phrases. Eyes, lips, and hands have become for her story, word, and gesture. And she repeats those phrases, under my skin, and 6 years old, perhaps 5. Why? It suggests that she's completing or drawing together a poetic structure that can represent, can contain the complexity of her past. And indeed, the poem could end there with the achievement of that understanding, the answer to her question. But it doesn't end there, it goes on. And that's always something to think about too. Why does the poem continue when it could feasibly end? I'll just read the first stanza here. And so this poem is for my father, mother, grandmother, grandfather, and all the storytellers, the conjurers who came before us. They made us shiver, not just over crab stealers hiding under the bed or a lady uncertain of her garb. They made us shiver also over faith, over tenderness, or that little tickle when a word hits a hidden crevice in the ear. Just air heralding the world or worlds that we think we dream up alone. Right? Think we dream up alone, but we don't. So what we learn here is that what started as a journey of self-discovery turns out to be a discovery of community. The speaker or poet is not a voice produced in isolation, or as she says later, by herself in front of a computer screen, but rather is the composite product of many previous storytellers. And so what the poet's offering here near the end of the poem is something we typically find at the beginning, so it's surprising. Namely, the dedication of the poem to a patron or forebearer. She says, and so this poem is for my mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, and so on. Those who came before us. By placing the dedication toward the end of the poem rather than at the start, Bobis shows us that we don't automatically know where we come from or whom we owe things to. We have to work to figure that out. And the poem itself that we are reading is a record of that labor. And so I think we feel that the poem has earned the final image, right? The last line of the poem, eyes, lips, hands conjoined, the umbilical cord restored. So in that image, I think we can see that the poem has asked us to speak ourselves into it, not only to honor the poet's past, but also to make this poem part of our collective storytelling. And that uncut umbilical cord represents, for that reason, both a renewed connection between the poet and her ancestors, which you might say is private and personal, but also the birth of the poem itself as it enters the wider world that we inhabit and in which we read it. The next poem, by Malaysian-Australian writer Maureen Tan, is also concerned with names, legacies, and an ambivalent relationship to the past. And somewhat interestingly, the title of the poem is also both an answer and a question, though we don't know that at the beginning, but we'll see how that goes as we continue to read. So I'll read the first stanza. Translucent Jade. My grandfather made me a gift when I was born. I used it for a while, until another gift, my mother's, flashed into view. Common in its place of origin, here her gift sparkled and sang, replaced the other. Not that his was jostled aside, but it sort of slipped away. No one seemed to mind, if they noticed, as it lay in disuse, and then was quite forgotten. Okay, so what can we notice in this first stanza? First, I think that we can see that the language is very ordinary and colloquial, much more like the prose of a short story than the elevated or high register we expect from lyric poetry. And I think that's part of the point, because it helps to naturalize the inference that most readers would make, which is that the translucent jade referred to by the title of the poem is the precious stone often given as a gift in Chinese culture and its diaspora. So even if you're not Chinese or Malaysian, you're probably familiar with the idea that jade is a valuable stone. So the straightforward nature of the language encourages a literal interpretation of the text that's reinforced by the cavalier and unthinking way in which the grandfather's gift just sort of slipped away as it gets carelessly replaced by the mothers. And you'll notice there's a distinct lack of agency here. The gifts are given to the poet, who passively receives them, and it's not clear how or why the new gift, common in its own place of origin, would seem more sparkly to the poet than the original jade, which we know is a precious material. But that's also the point. The lack of preciousness in the language, and this is a poem very much concerned with the difference between literal and figurative uses of language. The lack of preciousness in the language suggests a lack of preciousness about the gifts, a lack of scrupulousness, as it seems that one will do just as well as the other. Now, as in the previous poem, the break between stanzas indicates a lapse in time, right? We're thinking about these poems as dramas of self-development. Here, from a moment of childhood passivity to one of more mature deliberation and action. Today, I retrieved his gift from its silence. Barely, rarely used, it seemed mostly new. Pristine. I tried it on. It was a little strange, as if from a world I hadn't inhabited, but had heard stories about. Sometimes I felt an imposter. Sometimes I thought it reflected hidden aspects I could own. Now, in the first stanza, the mother's gift sparkled and sang. And given that we thought the poem was about jewelry, perhaps, sang seemed like the metaphor. But now, the poet retrieves the grandfather's gift from silence, which suggests that what's at stake is less material than ethereal, less a concrete object than a concept that comes in through the ears. And this brewing suspicion of ours is further developed when the poet tells us of the first gift that she tried it on, which could, on the one hand, refer to the literal trying on of a piece of jewelry or clothing, or more figuratively, it can refer to the trying on of a new experience or possibility for the self. And the gap between those two possibilities manifests as the poet's own feeling of strangeness, as she navigates the space between the then of the first stanza, when she first wore the grandfather's gift, and the now of the present, when she is trying on that earlier gift in a context in which it no longer seems to make sense, if it ever did. And we can see in this stanza the increasing presence of that personal pronoun I. We saw lack of agency in the first stanza. Now we see much more I, and that suggests the poet is emerging more fully into her own personhood, a responsible adulthood, where she is also more acutely aware of herself as occupying this awkward relationship to her past and her surroundings. We've seen how she's caught between two ancestors, two time periods, two gifts, and two interpretations of those gifts that we are sharing, the literal and the figurative. And she is not at home with any of these possibilities, at least in this stanza. So now we get to the third and final stanza in a pretty short poem. And we share the poet's questions. What exactly was the grandfather's gift? Was it benevolently bestowed? And why does it make the speaker feel so strange? And we begin to suspect that the casual quickness of that first stanza papered over something much more serious. And hence here the poet's register changes to become more earnestly questioning and critical, even existential. What vibrations are these? And notice that's a sonic word, but it can also be a philosophical word. Does this begin to become me? Do I to it belong? This translucent, slowly yielding music, Chinese name. Earlier, we saw Auden ask, what does the poet conceal? And we can see here that this poem is ingenious in containing a number of concealments. First, we learn that the gift from the first stanza refers not to a jade object at all, but rather to the author's Chinese name. This means that the poem we thought we understood was actually a kind of riddle, whose solution is only revealed in the final line. What does translucent jade refer to? It refers to a name, once used and now forgotten and rediscovered. And that idea of the riddle also describes the poet's mystified sense of self. Who am I? But the solution of the riddle here, Chinese name, casts a kind of retrospective light on the whole poem that makes all of its strangenesses, particularly those adjectives that could equally describe an object or a concept or a sound, sang, silence, vibrations, it makes them all come together and make sense. We understand that we are talking about a literal sound here, which is the sound of a name. And that's why the music of the name is slowly yielding, which I think is a really wonderfully chosen expression. It took the space of the poem, and indeed the duration of the author's life to date, keeping in mind that a poem is a representation of a poet's life. It took that entire period to cultivate a sense of hearing sensitive enough to appreciate the distinctive music or cultural legacy that her Chinese name has to offer. And yielding in this context has interesting meanings because it describes both something that offers a reward, like a high yield bond, which brings you money, but also something that's pliant to the touch, as though something yields easily to your hand, which is the opposite of the hardness or rigidity of jade when we think about it as a decorative stone or a precious object. So this poem that began so demotically and colloquially, right, just ordinary and nothing to observe here, ultimately convinces us that it has a special music of its own that mirrors that of the poet's Chinese name. And we remember in this context that lyric poetry, which refers to all these types of subjective poems, was originally a genre of song, a singing of the self. And in this light, we can now appreciate how the poem's management of concealment and surprise has worked to make that original Chinese name, once so foreign and casually forgotten, now seem beautiful and indeed familiar. Once you know the end of a riddle, you never forget it. So now every time we read this poem, we know what she's talking about. And in that way, there is a satisfying answer to the question with which this poem began. So the two poems we looked at so far actually have a lot in common. Both present us with a speaker who, in a moment of soul searching or self-estrangement of uncomfortability, that poet makes contact with the past in order to recuperate it, and then kind of proffers an inclusive view of identity that sees it as intimately bound up and capable of accommodating all the words of other people, whether it's stories or names. In the final poem we'll look at today, by the Indonesian-Australian writer Jaya Savage, things are not quite so easy. Not that those earlier poems were easy, but at least they came to satisfactory endings. Circular breathing resists that a little bit, as we'll see. This poem takes place not in the country of the poet's birth, or even in Australia, where the poet now lives, or sometimes lives. Savage is also often living abroad. But the poem takes place in Rome, which is the symbolic heart of the Old World as represented by Europe and the Roman Empire. So if the first two poems we saw were about feeling away while at home, being in Australia and thinking about one's roots, from which one is estranged and trying to make new connections with, as if you're a baby reconnecting the umbilical cord, this poem flips things as the poet encounters a sign of his home while he is actually away. There's a man with dreadlocks playing the didgeridoo in the Piazza di Santa Maria, and everyone is listening. Kids sit by the fountain, swapping smokes for laughs. Tourists lick gelati as they pass illicit markets. Belts, handbags, sunglasses, all made in the place scratched off. Nuns halt. Then the carabinieri, white gloves, black steel-cap boots glistening. What's going on here? We often think of Rome as a holy place, an historic place, a place of religious pilgrimage, but the atmosphere here is anything, I think, but holy. Instead, we get an image of modern capitalist globalization, which produces a raucous clash of cultures. Tourists who come for the ice cream rather than the churches, shopping for counterfeit luxury products, which have probably been produced in Asia rather than Italy, though the name is scratched off, so we don't know for sure. And the strange figure of the dreadlocked man playing the didgeridoo, which brings together two locations, the Caribbean and Australia, that feel just as out of place in this context, both being the new worlds compared to the old world, just as out of place as the nuns and the costumed carabinieri, who are the kind of federal police of Italy. They just as out of place as they do in the modern city. They feel like relics from past. And there's something carnival-like about this ambience, but also very unsettling and superficial. And that's a typically postmodern move to juxtapose a place like Rome with its deep history and spiritual significance with the comparatively meaningless pursuits of modern consumption and tourism. However, in the second stanza, we learn that wonder is still possible in this world. The crowd hems the young musician in, faces glazed with wonder. From where could the strange music have come? Surely not this hemisphere. A drone as deep as yet unexcavated ruins, far older even than the Forum. Armani, Ray-Ban, Dolce & Gabbana all sink at once into equivalence. So everyone in the piazza is arrested by the music, which doesn't feel like it's part of either old Rome or new Rome. Instead, it comes from farther away as possible, another hemisphere, and it's far older than the Forum, which is the oldest place in the city. And the rhetorical question is perhaps the most interesting feature of this stanza, because as an Australian, the poet surely knows the source of this music, right? We learn in the stanza to come that he's been exposed to the music of the didgeridoo before and knows quite a lot about it. And yet he identifies himself here with the tourists and the outsiders for whom the music is foreign or strange. The poet is Australian, yes, but the poet is not Aboriginal Australian. And so as we saw with the name Jade in the previous poem, the music of the didgeridoo both does not belong to him and yet somehow does belong to him. It's the heritage of Aboriginal Australians and yet is somehow meant to be for everyone, like all art, for free, in a way that contrasts with that meretricious exclusivity of Italian luxury brands. So he's thinking through that relationship. And in the last two stanzas, we can see the author drawing on a rather deep knowledge of Australia to establish some kind of relationship to the music that he's listening to. I'll just read the first stanza here. He doesn't do the kangaroo, the mosquito, or the speeding Holden. Just the one dark, warm, lush hum. You hear the language imitating a drone there with all those monosyllables. The clean energy of circular breathing, lungs that instrument the sum, familiar as the accordion, yet strange, as though not for money, not just for fun, but for reasons unknowable, some vast, unhurried So as the many internal rhymes here start to pull the poet's experience together, we have an increasing impression of order and development through those rhymes. We learn that he's familiar with the technique of circular breathing, by which the player breathes through the nose and out through the mouth at the same time, which allows them to create that long, uninterrupted drone sound. And he knows some of the touchstones of Australian life, like the kangaroo and the mosquito, which are Aboriginal dances, as well as Holden, which is an Australian brand of car. And yet he ends the third stanza by saying that he doesn't know why the music exists. It's not just for money, it's not for fun, but it seems to be connected to something deeper, more resonant, more permanent, something like the of Eastern mysticism, which is understood to be the most fundamental sound of the universe. So what we have here is a representation of how a transcendent aesthetic experience can shock a person out of their ordinary routines and provoke wonder, a new kind of cultural awareness that leads to deeper reflections on who one is. And like the earlier poems, this poem is trying to perform the action that it describes. It recreates the poet's experience of wonder to get us as readers of that experience to be knocked into a sense of wonder ourselves. And yet, there's a big qualification at the end of this poem. At the beginning of stanza 4, the speaker says, "I want to bolt up the stairs of the fountain and claim that sound as the sound of my home, but stop." He thinks that he wants to possess that music or even own it, as we saw own used in Translucent Jade, as a mark of national pride or personal identity. And yet the poet stops himself from doing that because he remembers how he once took such music entirely for granted when he ignored a truer player of the music, by which I think he means an Aboriginal Australian, when he was in the heart of Brisbane. He says, "But stop when I recall how rarely I slow to hear the truer player busking in King George Square." It's a cliche to say that we don't appreciate what we have until it's gone. And here the poet twists that cliche to suggest we don't appreciate what we have until it's wrenched out of its original context, appropriated, you might say, and presented to us as something foreign, whether that be the like sound of circular breathing, the childhood stories of This Is Where It Begins, or the Chinese name of Translucent Jade. The cool knowingness of the first stanzas then degenerates here into a kind of physical collapse. The poet stops walking normally and starts to feel physically ill. He says, "My stomach fills with fire." He ends the poem by trying to lose himself in an image of the sublime. Far above, cold stars wheel around the spire of Rome's oldest Christian church. Here, I think he's associating the vastness of the universe with the ancientness of Rome's religions. But to me, at least, that gesture feels relatively empty and unconsoling. The poet remains, at the end of this poem, an exile both from Europe and in Europe. But the poem itself suggests that the only way he can consolidate his identity and return to an authentic sense of self is by returning to Australia in pursuit of a more meaningful connection to all of the artistic traditions that are found there, whether they be Indigenous or European or other. So to conclude my discussion of these three poems, I want to draw your attention to 3 points. First, it's helpful to understand poems as carefully shaped representations of subjective experience. A poem often starts from a place of irresolution or disequilibrium. And part of our job as readers and as speakers of the poem is to track how the poet addresses that problem and then resolves or fails to resolve it. So This Is Where It Begins, the problem was one of origins and definitions. What is this? Where does it start? What is it? In Translucent Jade, the problem was the speaker's unsettled attitude toward her multiple names. And in Circular Breathing, it's about the seeker's search for an authentic cultural identity where they feel neither included nor excluded by all their different touchstones. And in the first 2 poems, the speakers make peace with their past by including them into their present. While in Circular Breathing, I think we saw how the speaker remains in a state of relative uncertainty, or what you might call hopeful limbo. Second, poems of identity, especially by migrants, tend to pay particular attention to a series of binary opposites. Childhood versus adulthood, native country versus adopted country, past versus present, exile versus belonging. And we can understand how these binaries arise from the experience of being caught between multiple languages, histories, and cultures. An experience that these poems often trace through the organization of the stanzas, which usually track different moments in times or physical locations. But those oppositions are also linked to the fact that multicultural poets face the specific challenge of turning the private life of the ethnically marked individual into a public poem that makes that self accessible or legible to other people. Hence, poems of identity like these often feature other works of art, like stories or songs or music, that helped their writers learn to understand themselves. And for that reason, we can understand how the poems that they produce, the ones that we just read, they represent yet another effort to convey knowledge of oneself to others in an artistically graspable and engaging form. So they are part of a tradition of storytelling through art. When reading a poem, therefore, you need to be sensitive to the drama of its unfolding and the way that the poet calibrates their language and imagery to match every stage of that drama. In conditions of multiculturalism, poets can't just take for granted that a common language or set of tropes will be automatically understood by all readers, right? We live in a fractured, mosaic-like world. Instead, they need to create their own language over the course of the poem, which is often less a matter of using specific literary techniques than asking us to trace how broader features like tone, register, vocabulary, and styles of expression give verbal shape and credibility to a person whose worldview we are invited to share. Poetic storytelling is probably the oldest tool we have as human beings for understanding ourselves and others. And as these poems show, it remains as potent today as it was in ancient Rome, or indeed in Circular Breathing, pre-colonial Australia. So I hope that shed some light on why I find these poems so interesting, and I look forward to taking any questions. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matthew. I'll just quickly go back to sharing my screen. In the meantime, please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A function or in the chat. Thank you. Amazing. Perfect. All good? Perfect. Thank you. So while everyone is typing in the questions, Matthew, some of the questions that we usually get is where can I find some more resources relating to this topic?
Sure. Well, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk a critic named Helen Vendler, who talks about the fact that we don't listen to poems. Poets tend not to be talking at us, where we're passive recipients of the poem, but rather we're asked to inhabit the role of the speaker and in some ways enact the drama of the poem. I think that if you want to learn more about that theory of poetry, which I think unlocks a lot of the strangeness of poetry, it makes it a lot more fun to read poetry, I highly recommend a book she wrote called Poets, Poems, Poetry, which was published in 2002, which was the textbook basically that she created for a class that she taught for many, many years at Harvard. Helen Bendler passed away last year, but for a good generation, she was the most influential and authoritative poetry critic in America. She helped introduce a lot of very strange and unusual poets to the wider public, especially female poets whose experiences might not have been widely shared by especially male members of the public. So she's not a bad guide to help understand the poet of identity.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And while everyone is typing the questions in, I wanted to ask a little bit more of a personal question in terms of what do you teach undergraduate students, so students that are coming straight from high school, and yeah, a little bit about the subject that you do often, the ones that you teach, and what you enjoy the most about them.
Happy to answer that. So my first love as an undergraduate was poetry, and when I did an honors thesis, it happened to be on the poetry of W.H. Auden, who I mentioned here. But when I became an academic, I shifted. So now my specialty is actually the novel. So I spend a lot more time teaching the history of the novel, especially the 19th century novel. So I teach a class on novel worlds, which is a history of the novel from the 17th century to the present, and also a course on the 19th century novel specifically. It's actually pretty close to poetry, though, because a big part of what we do with the novel is try to understand the sensibilities and perspectives of other people. It's the best tool we have for getting to know someone else's mind. So there's a lot of continuity there. But the course I want to mention, and which is most relevant to this audience, is our first year class, which I developed and coordinated, called The Idea of the Classic. This is a course that all first year English majors will take. It's required to proceed in the major. And in this course, I wanted to ask, why do we have certain books that you grow up hearing the names of, certain authors that are famous that you know are classic, and you feel you ought to read them? But why? Why do you feel you have to read them? Is that the right thing to feel? What are the reasons for that? And how does something achieve that kind of high canonical or classic status in our culture? So in that class, I teach it along with several other members of the department, and we read a wide range of texts, all the way from the Odyssey and the Ramayana, which are, ancient epics, to a modern Australian novel called The Watchtower by Elizabeth Harrower, and to The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which is a novel from the 1920s. And we're trying to ask, why do certain books become famous? And what is the distinctive pleasure or interest that inheres with these books that have been elevated as great above all the others? So it's really an opportunity for students to reflect upon the nature of literary value and come to their own determinations about what they think is worthy or valuable in the realm of art.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Again, on the more personal questions, what would your advice be for Year 12 students currently in high school in the lead up to their assessments, especially when it comes to poetry?
Right. So having worked with a lot of students who have just come out of the HSC, it's really interesting because there is a certain style of preparing for the HSC that involves a lot of identifying of kind of poetic techniques. You notice I didn't do a lot of that in my presentation. So I didn't single out, here's, where assonance is taking place, or here's a metaphor, or here's a pathetic fallacy. I mention all those things along the way, but one thing I think it's important to do, whether you're in the HSC or outside of the HSC, is think about the broader container for all those techniques. What is the larger movement of mind or imaginative activity that's taking place that brings all of those techniques together to a kind of concerted purpose? So I think that the best thing students can do is try to understand these poems as not just kind of paintings on the wall that we sort of analyze all the features of, but as real living people in a way, where we're being asked to understand how all of the verbal features together give us the sense of a complex flesh and blood perspective. And if you're doing that, I guarantee that you'll have a deeper appreciation and a better argument about how all those different poetic techniques are working together to create something really meaningful and hopefully pleasurable in your experience of it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Greatly appreciate it. You can continue to put any more questions in the Q&A, and we can answer them as well. Just looking at time. Um, I want to start by saying a huge thank you to Matthew for all his work and everything that he shared with us today. And also thank you to everyone for attending and asking questions. Before you leave, we would love to hear your thoughts on today's talk. If you could please fill in the evaluation survey, that would be fantastic. This is to really help us improve and incorporate more English topics in the future. So please feel free to share any ideas that you may have. My colleague Charlotte will just also share the link in the chat if that's easier for everyone, and we'll just leave the QR code for a little bit longer. Matthew, we've just received a question. So if students were to pick about 3 poems to focus on the HSC response, but need to link these ideas and language used in full suite, how would you suggest that they do so?
Sorry, I just missed the last part of the question. If they need to link 3 poems, what?
To the ideas and language used in the full suite, how would you suggest that they do so?
Well, I mean, what I tried to do in the presentation was suggest that the poem itself is a particular slice of language. Like there's careful choices made about the kinds of words that are used. So anytime you're thinking about the language of a poem, think about all the words that are not being used. And that can help you get a sense of why these specific words have been chosen. And if I'm understanding the question correctly, and forgive me if I'm not, the the um, specialized vocabulary that a poet uses, whether they're drawing from dialect or personal mythology or modern consumer culture, all different things we saw in these poems, that is the kind of the type of discriminations I think you need to be making when you're trying to understand how a person imagines their own being, right? We don't use all the words that are available. We use a particular set of words that become our personal idioms or lexicon. And I think that if you're trying to understand the language of a poem and its relation to identity in any poem, including these three, you need to figure out what the outlines are of that particular word world.
Great, thank you for that. Um, and someone has just sent through, thanks, Matthew, some really interesting insights. And just to reiterate Edwina's question that yes, the recording will be available later. So just give us just 1 week or two, just to make sure that we do the post edit. And then I will make sure that I share this with everyone in addition to the PowerPoint slides as well, and it will be uploaded on our website, on our webpage, where it will be free for everyone to access as well. So please feel free to share with colleagues, teachers, students, and yeah, we really appreciate you being here tonight.